Let me paint you a picture. You're in a conversation in English. A colleague, a friend, a manager, someone you trust, is talking to you about something. A plan you're working on, a decision you're about to make, a path you're thinking of taking. And as they talk, you hear something in what they're saying that doesn't quite feel like information. It doesn't feel like advice, exactly. It doesn't feel like disagreement. It feels like something else, something a little more urgent. Like they're trying to tell you something important without quite saying it directly. Like they're reaching toward you with a piece of knowledge that matters, wrapping it in careful language and hoping you'll catch it before it's too late. And you hear the careful language, but you're not completely sure whether what you're hearing is a genuine warning, something you really need to stop and pay attention to, or just a general observation, a casual comment, something you can note and move on from. And so you nod, and you move on, and later, sometimes much later, you find out that it was a warning, that the careful language was trying to save you from something. And you wish, more than a little, that you'd caught it in the moment when it was offered. If something like that has happened to you, and I think it's happened to most of us, in one language or another, then today's lesson is going to matter to you in a very real way. Because today, we are going to talk about how English speakers warn each other. Not the dramatic, watch out kind of warning. The quiet kind, the careful kind, the professionally polite and personally gentle kind that wraps caution in considerate language and hopes you'll hear what's underneath. And by the end of this lesson, you will hear it. Welcome back. My name is Alex, and this is English in Fluency, the channel where we go inside the real, living, fully human English language and understand how it actually works when people are talking to each other about things that matter. Today's topic, how speakers warn politely, is one that I think is genuinely exciting, because it's about one of the most considerate and most important things one person can do for another: to see something coming that the other person hasn't seen yet, to have knowledge or experience or a perspective that makes you understand that the path ahead has a problem in it, and to offer that knowledge with care, in a way that respects the other person's intelligence and autonomy without alarming them unnecessarily. That is what a polite warning is, and the specific language English speakers use to do it, the phrases, the structures, the tones, the patterns, is what we're going to spend today learning to hear. Let me introduce the people we're going to spend time with today. Our main character is a man named Declan. Declan is 32 years old. He works at a financial services firm as an analyst, and he's been using English professionally for about 5 years. His English is genuinely strong. He reads and writes fluently. He presents with confidence. He holds complex conversations without strain. But he has a gap that's become clearer to him over the past year. He misses polite warnings. When colleagues or managers or clients try to flag a concern, to signal a risk, to quietly indicate that something he's planning might have a problem, he sometimes doesn't catch it. He hears the politeness and misses the caution underneath it. He processes the consideration and misses the content. And the result has been a few situations where he walked into something preventable, because someone tried to warn him and the warning didn't land. Declan's closest colleague and friend is a woman named Priya. Priya is 35, highly experienced, and someone who has worked in several different professional environments and absorbed the warning language of each one. She's particularly good at two things: giving warnings in a way that is honest but not alarmist, and hearing warnings that other people might miss. Being around Priya has gradually changed the quality of Declan's professional listening, though he's only recently started to consciously understand why. There's also a character named Bernard. Bernard is Declan's most senior manager, 57, deeply experienced, and someone who almost never says anything directly when a more careful formulation is available. His warnings come wrapped in years of professional polish. They are often structured as questions or as observations about general tendencies in the industry, or as stories about other projects he's worked on. Bernard never says, "Watch out, this could go wrong." He says things like, "Interesting." One thing I've found over the years with approaches like this is, and what follows is the warning. It's valuable. It's real. But you have to be listening at the right level to receive it. And finally, there's a client named Sylvia. Sylvia heads the risk management division of one of Declan's firm's main clients. She's 48, direct in some ways and very careful in others, and she expresses warnings in a particular professional register that Declan has been learning to read. When Sylvia has a concern about something in the work, she doesn't say, "This is wrong." She says things like, "I want to make sure we're thinking about," or, "One thing I'd want us to have clearly covered is," and these phrases are not casual questions. They are precision-engineered signals that something specific needs to be addressed before it becomes a problem. Okay, let's begin. It's a Monday morning. Declan is preparing a presentation for an important client meeting on Wednesday. He's been working on it over the weekend, he feels good about it, and he's doing a quick run-through with Priya before he finalizes everything. She listens carefully as he walks her through the main points. She nods in the right places. She asks a couple of questions about the data. And then, when he finishes, she's quiet for just a moment before she says, "It's solid. I think there's one thing that might be worth double-checking before Wednesday. The assumptions in Section 3. The numbers look right, but I just want to make sure they're using the most current data set. It could come up." Declan nods. He says he'll check. And he's about to move on when something makes him pause. Something in the way Priya said, "It could come up." The slight gravity in that phrase, the specificity of Section 3, the fact that she said double-checking rather than looking at, makes him sit with her comment a little longer than he would have a year ago. He says, "When you say it could come up, do you know something I should know?" Priya says, "I don't know anything specific." But Sylvia is going to be in that meeting, and Sylvia's team recently ran their own analysis on some of the same underlying data. If your assumptions and hers are slightly different, she's going to notice. And she's going to ask about it in the room. Declan is quiet for a second. Then he says, "That would be bad." Priya says, "It could be uncomfortable. Worth half an hour of checking now rather than an explanation on Wednesday." And there it is, the full warning unpacked. Priya knew something, not a certainty, but a probability. And she offered it carefully. Might be worth double-checking. It could come up. Those were the warning phrases. They weren't dramatic. They weren't, "Declan, stop, there's a serious problem here." They were measured, specific, and considerate. and they contained a real piece of professional intelligence that was genuinely going to protect Declan if he acted on it. He did act on it. He spent 2 hours on Monday afternoon checking the data assumptions. He found a discrepancy, not huge, but real. He updated the numbers. On Wednesday, Sylvia asked directly about the data source for Section 3. And Declan was ready. He named the current data set, explained why he'd used it, and Sylvia nodded and moved on. Afterward, Priya caught his eye across the room and gave the smallest possible nod. He knew what it meant. Let's now go through the main forms that polite warnings take in English, because they're varied and specific, and knowing them gives you a complete and practical map of this part of the language. The first form is the just to flag opener. This is one of the most common warning introductions in professional English. Just to flag. One thing to flag. I just wanted to flag something. I wanted to flag this before we go any further. The word flag is a signal in itself. It means, I'm raising something to your attention because I think you need to be aware of it. It's not criticism. It's not an objection. It's the verbal equivalent of putting a marker on something and saying, look here before you move past this. Just to flag. Warnings are typically about specific risks or concerns that the speaker has noticed and wants the listener to have the chance to address. They're professional, they're helpful, and they're extremely common in workplace English. When someone says, just to flag to you, stop. What comes next is worth hearing. The second form is the just want to make sure check. I just want to make sure we've thought about. I just want to make sure we're covered on. I want to make sure we've considered. Just checking that we've thought through. These phrases look like they're asking whether something has been considered. But in practice, they're often warnings that something hasn't been considered, or hasn't been considered enough. The speaker uses this structure because it gives the listener a face-saving way to say, actually, I'm not sure we have thought about that, without any admission of error having to be made first. The question structure is a kindness. It says, I think there might be a gap here, and I'm framing this as a question so that if there is a gap, we can fill it without anyone having to feel defensive about it. Sylvia uses this form constantly, and Declan has been learning to hear it. I just want to make sure we're thinking about, from Sylvia means, I'm worried we're not thinking about this enough, and I want it addressed. It doesn't mean she's uncertain whether it's been considered. She usually knows. She's using the question form as a professional courtesy, a way of raising the concern that keeps the conversation collaborative rather than confrontational. The third form is the experience-based caution. This is when a speaker warns by drawing on their own past experience, sharing a story, or an observation from a previous situation where something similar went wrong. I've seen this before, and in my experience, this kind of thing tends to, we had a similar situation once, and what happened was, I remember when we tried something like this, and one thing I've learned from projects like this is, these warnings are particularly powerful because they're not just flagging a theoretical risk. They're saying, this is not a hypothetical. I have seen this exact kind of thing cause a problem, and I don't want to see it happen again here. Bernard uses this form almost exclusively. His warnings almost always come through stories about other projects, other situations, other decisions that looked reasonable at the time but had consequences that weren't anticipated. He never says, "I think you're making a mistake." He says, "Interesting. I was on a project a few years back where we faced something similar, and what we found was..." And the story is the warning. It's generous, and it's wise, and it requires the listener to do the work of making the connection between the story and the current situation. But if you're listening at the right level, the connection is always clear. Bernard's stories are never pure reminiscence. They always have a point, and the point is always about where the current path might lead. The fourth form is the gentle conditional warning. This is when a speaker frames a warning as a conditional statement. If X happens, then Y might follow, which sounds less alarming than a direct warning but communicates the same information. If we go with this timeline, we might find ourselves under pressure in the final phase. If the client pushes back on this, it could affect the whole scope. If the data turns out to be slightly off, that section is vulnerable. If we haven't fully confirmed the budget, this could create problems later. The conditional frame says, "I'm not predicting disaster. I'm just making sure you can see the connection between A and B. You decide how to respond to that. But the information is there, and it's a warning." The "if" is carrying the concern, and the "might" or "could" after it is carrying the consequence. The fifth form is the softened direct warning. This is when the speaker wants to be clear enough that the warning lands, but doesn't want to cause unnecessary alarm or sound presumptuous. So they soften the directness with specific phrases that acknowledge the listener's own knowledge and judgment while still making the concern clear. It might be worth pausing on this. You might want to give this another look. It could be worth thinking about this a bit more. I'd want to double-check that part. I wonder if it's worth revisiting this. One thing you might want to consider: these phrases are softer than "stop, this is a problem," but much clearer than a vague "just something to keep in mind." The "might" and the "could" and the "worth" are doing the softening, but the content, the specific thing being flagged, is clear. And the listener who knows this structure understands. This is a warning. I should take this seriously. Priya's warning to Declan was a softened, direct warning. It might be worth double-checking. It could come up. Both of those were clear once you knew the structure. They weren't saying, "Maybe look at this when you get a chance." They were saying, "This is a specific risk, in a specific place, with a specific consequence. Please address it." The sixth form is the rhetorical question warning. This is when a speaker frames their concern as a question, not because they don't know the answer, but because asking the question forces the listener to think through the issue themselves. Have we confirmed the legal side of this? Is everyone on the client team aware of this change? Do we know what happens if the timeline slips? Has this been run by compliance? Are we confident in these projections? These questions are warnings disguised as due diligence inquiries. They're saying, "I'm not sure we've covered this, and I think we need to." But they say it in a way that invites the listener to make that assessment themselves rather than being told. This form is particularly common in meetings, where senior people often use rhetorical questions to flag concerns without wanting to explicitly take ownership of them, either because they're not certain or because they want others to think through the issue rather than just receiving a verdict. Bernard uses this form frequently. When he says, "Has legal had a look at this?" in a meeting, he usually already knows whether legal has looked at it. And if the answer is no, the question is the warning. The question is saying, they should have looked at this, and if they haven't, that's a problem you need to address before this goes any further. Let's go deeper into the story. It's Wednesday. The presentation happened. The data was solid. Sylvia was satisfied. Declan is feeling good. But Wednesday afternoon brings a different kind of warning situation. One that's less about a specific document and more about a broader relationship risk that Declan hasn't fully seen. He's having a catch-up with Bernard after the Wednesday meeting. Bernard is generally positive about how things went. He talks about the client relationship, about the good feedback from the presentation, about the direction of the project, and then, seemingly in passing, he says, "One thing I've noticed, and I may be wrong about this, is that the communication with Sylvia's team has been slightly more through you than through the full project team. I don't have concerns about that per se, but in my experience, when one person becomes the primary channel to a client at this level, it can create a certain fragility. If for any reason that one channel is interrupted, holidays, illness, change of role, the relationship can feel quite exposed. Worth being mindful of." He says it pleasantly. He smiles. He moves on to the next topic. Declan hears it. He actually hears it, which is progress, because 18 months ago he might have let it slide as general observation. He thinks about what Bernard said. One person as primary channel. Fragility. Worth being mindful of. And he translates, Bernard is warning him that the project is too dependent on his individual relationship with Sylvia, and that this is a risk, not just to the project, but to Declan himself if anything changes. He's not just observing. He's advising Declan to bring the wider team into the client relationship more deliberately, before something happens that makes it necessary. After the meeting, Declan goes to Priya. He tells her what Bernard said. She listens, and then she says, "What do you think he meant?" Declan says, "He meant I've been taking too much of the client relationship on myself, and it's created a dependency. He wants me to bring you and the team in more." Priya says, "That's what I heard too." Declan says, "Did you know he was going to say that?" Priya says, "I thought he might. It's something I'd noticed as well." Declan says, "Why didn't you say something?" Priya is quiet for a moment. Then she says, "I was waiting to see if you noticed yourself. And then, when you didn't, I was figuring out the right time. Bernard got there first." Declan says, "So you were warning me in your own way? By waiting?" Priya says, "No, I was just being patient. The warning I would have given you is the same one Bernard gave you, just from someone less senior." And this exchange reveals something important about polite warnings that I want to make sure we sit with. Warnings are rarely given without some consideration of timing. A warning given too early, before a problem is visible, often doesn't land. A warning given at exactly the right moment, when the person is ready to receive it, lands cleanly and is acted on. Bernard chose his moment. He waited until the immediate success of the presentation was established, until Declan was in a positive and open state, and then he offered the warning in a way that was careful and constructive, rather than alarming. The timing was part of the technique. This is something to think about as a listener. When a warning comes, especially from someone experienced, someone who has been watching a situation carefully, it's worth asking, why is this person saying this now? What do they know about the situation that made this the right moment to flag it? The answer to that question often gives you additional information about the seriousness of the concern. Let's talk about something that Declan and Priya discuss on Thursday, because there's a distinction she makes that I think is genuinely important for understanding polite warnings in English. She says, there are two kinds of polite warning. There's the warning that's polite because the person wants to protect your feelings. And there's the warning that's polite because the person respects your intelligence and wants you to think it through yourself rather than just be told. Declan says, what's the difference in practice? Priya says, the first one tends to be softer, more hedged, more careful, more cushioned. It's trying not to alarm you. The second one tends to be more structured. It gives you enough to work with, asks a question, tells a story, presents the conditional, and then lets you draw the conclusion. It trusts you to get there. Declan says, Bernard's warnings are the second kind. Priya says, mostly, yes. He respects you enough not to tell you what to think. He just makes sure you have the information to think with. Declan says, and yours? Priya smiles. Mine are somewhere in the middle. I'm protective of you, and I also think you're smart enough to figure things out. So, sometimes I just flag and get out of the way. This distinction, the protective warning versus the structured, trusting warning, is really useful to hold on to, not because one is better than the other, but because understanding which kind you're receiving helps you calibrate your response. If someone is cushioning the warning because they're worried about your reaction, the real message might be even stronger than what they're saying. The cushioning is evidence of seriousness. If someone is giving you the structured, trusting warning, the conditional, the story, the rhetorical question, they're betting on your intelligence to close the gap. And closing the gap is what's required of you. Let's bring Sylvia into focus for a moment, because she appears again later in the week, in a situation that gives Declan a chance to hear a very specific kind of professional warning that deserves its own attention. On Friday, Declan is on a call with Sylvia about the next phase of the project. She's reviewing the proposed approach for the following quarter. She asks a few questions, she seems broadly positive, and then she says, one thing I want to make sure we have really clearly thought through is the communication plan for when results come in. In my experience with programs like this, the results phase is where things can get complicated, particularly if results are mixed. It's worth having a very clear plan for how those conversations get managed before we get to that point, rather than after. She says it calmly. She says it helpfully. She says it as if it's just a general consideration. But Declan, who has been paying a different kind of attention this week, hears what's underneath it. He hears, Sylvia knows that the results might be mixed. She knows that mixed results are going to be politically difficult inside her organization. And she's warning Declan, now, when there's time to prepare, that the communication plan needs to be robust, because she's anticipating a moment of difficulty, and she wants the firm to be ready for it rather than caught flat-footed. It's not a casual observation. It's a forward-looking, experience-based caution from someone who knows her own organization's dynamics and is trying to share that knowledge usefully. Declan says, "That's a really important point. When you say complicated, are you thinking about specific stakeholders we should have a plan for?" Sylvia says, "I'm thinking about the senior leadership group, yes. They'll have expectations going in, and managing those expectations, especially if the picture is nuanced, is something we should be deliberate about." And now it's even clearer. She's warning him about a specific audience, a specific dynamic, a specific political risk inside her organization that he and the team need to plan for. The whole conversation started with, "I want to make sure we've really clearly thought through." That was the warning opener. Everything after it was the content of the warning. Declan says he'll bring it back to the team and build a specific communication plan for the results phase. Sylvia says, "I think that would be very worthwhile." Very worthwhile, from Sylvia in that tone, means, "Yes, please, this matters. Don't let this slide." He hears it. Now let's go into our practice exercises, because as always, the learning only becomes real when you practice it. The first exercise is the warning phrase bank. Over the next week, build a personal collection of polite warning phrases that you hear in English. Every time someone says something that feels like a warning, whether it's "just to flag," "I want to make sure we've thought about," "in my experience," "it might be worth," "if we go this route," or anything else, add it to your collection. Write it down. Note the context. Note what the warning was about. By the end of the week, you'll have a personal library of warning language that's grounded in real conversations you actually heard. And that personal library will make you significantly faster at recognizing warnings in the future. The second exercise is the beneath the politeness drill. Take any polite warning phrase, "It might be worth having another look at this," or "I just want to make sure we've covered this," or "in my experience, this kind of thing tends to," and practice translating it into its unpolished equivalent. What is this person actually saying, stripped of the considerate framing? "You need to look at this again." "I don't think we've covered this." This is going to be a problem. The translation doesn't mean the polite version is dishonest. It means you understand what the polite version is carrying, and being able to translate gives you the content while keeping your appreciation of the consideration. The third exercise is timing observation. When you hear a polite warning in English, in a conversation, in a podcast, in a film, pay attention to the timing. Why is this warning being given now? What has just happened that made this the right moment? What do the circumstances tell you about the seriousness of the concern? A warning given at a very specific moment, just before a decision, just after a success, just as something is about to be finalized, is usually a sign that the person giving it has been watching carefully and chose their moment deliberately. The deliberateness of the timing is itself a signal. The fourth exercise is the conditional map. For 1 week, every time you hear a conditional warning structure in English, if X, then Y might follow. Map the conditional. What's the X? What's the Y? How likely is X? How serious is Y? This exercise trains you to hear conditional warnings as real risk assessments rather than hypothetical musings. Most of the time, when someone uses a conditional to warn you, they believe X is fairly likely and Y is fairly significant. The conditional framing is courtesy, not minimization. And the fifth exercise is the experience story listen. This one specifically targets Bernard-style warnings, the experience-based story that contains a warning without stating it directly. When you hear someone tell a story from their past experience in the context of a current decision or plan, practice identifying. What is the warning in this story? What is the speaker suggesting might happen here, based on what happened there? And what action does the story imply you should take? This exercise builds your ability to receive indirect wisdom, the kind that comes from experience and is offered in the form of a story rather than a direct instruction. Let's bring Declan back for the final scene of the week. It's Friday afternoon, close to the end of the day. Declan is wrapping up, and Priya stops by his desk. She says, "Good week?" He says, "Probably one of the more educational weeks I've had in a while." She says, "Yeah?" He says, "I've been thinking about how much warning language I've been missing. How many times someone flagged something carefully, and I processed the careful and missed the flag." Priya says, "What changed?" Declan says, "I started listening for what's underneath the politeness. I started asking myself, when someone says, 'it might be worth,' or 'just to flag,' what are they actually trying to tell me?" Priya says, "And?" Declan says, "And they're almost always trying to protect me from something. They have information or experience that I don't have, and they're offering it in a way that respects me enough not to be blunt about it. The politeness is the care, not the obstacle." Priya is quiet for a moment. Then she says, "That's actually a really good way of putting it." Declan says, "The politeness is the care, not the obstacle. Someone should teach that." Priya smiles. "Maybe someone will." And that is the heart of today's lesson in a sentence. The politeness is the care, not the obstacle. When someone warns you politely in English, when they say, "just to flag," or "in my experience," or "I want to make sure we've thought about," the careful language they're using is not concealing the warning. It is the warning, delivered with consideration for your feelings, your autonomy, and your intelligence. The care is real. The warning is real. And hearing both of them at the same time without losing one in the other is what it means to be a genuinely fluent English listener. Let me bring everything together now, clearly and warmly, so you carry it all with you. Today we followed Declan through a week of learning to hear polite warnings in real English conversation. We met Priya, whose measured, specific, carefully timed warnings are built on real knowledge and genuine care. We met Bernard, whose experience-based cautions come through stories and questions and observations rather than direct statements, and whose warnings require the listener to do the final step of making the connection. And we met Sylvia, whose professional warning language is precise, structured, and deeply informative once you know how to receive it. We covered 6 main forms that polite warnings take in English. The just to flag opener, which raises something to attention. The just want to make sure check, which flags a gap in the form of a question. The experience-based caution, which shares a story that contains the warning. The gentle conditional, which maps a risk by connecting a possible action to a possible consequence. The softened direct warning, which states the concern clearly but with courtesy. And the rhetorical question warning, which invites the listener to think through the issue themselves. We talked about the distinction between the protective warning and the structured, trusting warning. and why understanding which kind you're receiving helps you calibrate your response. We talked about timing, why warnings are often given at specific, deliberate moments, and what the timing tells you about the seriousness of the concern. And we landed on the central insight. The politeness is the care, not the obstacle. And we gave you 5 exercises: the warning phrase bank, the beneath the politeness drill, timing observation, the conditional map, and the experience story listen, to take everything from today into your real English listening life. Polite warnings are one of the most generous things one person can offer another. They represent someone using their knowledge and experience to try to protect you from something you can't yet see. Learning to hear them, to catch the flag inside the careful language, to feel the caution inside the considerate phrasing, is one of the most valuable listening skills you can develop. Not just for English, for life. If today's lesson gave you something real, a new sensitivity to warning language, a new respect for the care embedded in polite caution, a new confidence that you can hear what's underneath when it matters, please share it. Share it with someone who has been missing the warnings. Share it with someone who processes the politeness and loses the content. Share it with anyone who wants to be the kind of English listener who catches things before they become problems. English in Fluency exists for all of you, and we have so much more ahead. Please subscribe and stay with us for every new lesson. This channel is built on the belief that real English fluency means hearing the whole conversation, not just the surface, but the depth. And we are nowhere near finished exploring that depth together. This is Alex from English in Fluency. Thank you for being here today, for listening carefully enough to catch what I was really saying, not just what the words said. That's the skill. That's the whole skill. I'll see you in the next one. And until then, hear the flag, feel the care, and catch the warning before it becomes the problem.